Shivering on cold concrete, Marcus watched his empire crumble. Once commanding boardrooms, now clutching a cardboard sign, he had become invisible to the very world he built. Yet, in his darkest moment, Beggar acts boldly became not just his story, but his salvation. His fingers, once adorned with gold, now traced the blueprint of redemption. Now I'll create the narrative chapters for you. Marcus Sullivan stared at his reflection in a store window, barely recognizing the haggard face that stared back at him. 6 months ago, he had been the CEO of Sullivan Technologies, a billion-dollar tech empire that he had built from the ground up over 20 years of relentless work and innovation. Now, he owned nothing but the clothes on his back, a worn backpack containing his few remaining possessions, and a cardboard sign that read, "Former CEO, will work for food." The irony wasn't lost on him. How quickly the mighty could fall, how swiftly fortune could turn on even the most successful among us. The cold December wind cut through his threadbare jacket, a far cry from the tailored suits that had once been his daily uniform. He had lost it all in a perfect storm of bad investments, a market crash, and a betrayal by his CFO, who had been siphoning funds for years without his knowledge. By the time Marcus discovered the fraud, it was too late. The company was in freefall. Creditors were circling, and the board had unceremoniously removed him from his position. The lawsuits that followed stripped him of his personal assets, his mansion, his cars, and finally, his dignity. The financial world had a short memory for success and a long one for failure, and Marcus Sullivan had become a cautionary tale overnight. He shuffled down the street toward the shelter where he had been staying for the past 3 weeks, his shoulders hunched against both the cold and the shame that followed him like a shadow. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the hunger. It was the looks of pity or disgust from people who once would have begged for 5 minutes of his time. It was the former colleagues who crossed the street to avoid having to acknowledge him. It was the complete erasure of the person he had been, replaced by a stereotype that people could safely ignore as they hurried past. In their eyes, he was no longer Marcus Sullivan, innovative tech leader and philanthropist. He was simply a homeless man, a problem to be avoided. The shelter was crowded that night, filled with the desperate and the forgotten, each with their own story of how they had ended up there. Marcus found a corner space and sat on his thin mattress, pulling out a dog-eared notebook from his backpack. Despite everything, he couldn't stop his mind from working, from analyzing, from seeking solutions. It was what had made him successful once, this relentless problem-solving instinct. And it was perhaps the one thing they couldn't take away from him. In the notebook were scribbled ideas, observations, and most recently, notes about his former company that he had gathered from news articles and financial reports freely available at the public library. The new CEO of Sullivan Technologies, Jennifer Reeves, had been making headlines with her ambitious new direction for the company, but Marcus could see fundamental flaws in her strategy. She was repeating the same mistakes that had plagued other tech firms in the sector, pushing for rapid expansion without solidifying the core business, diversifying into markets where they had no competitive advantage, and worst of all, neglecting the innovative edge that had made Sullivan Technologies stand out in the first place. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. And despite everything, Marcus felt a pang of sadness for the company he had built and the employees whose livelihoods depended on its success. As the lights dimmed in the shelter and the sounds of restless sleep filled the room, Marcus continued to write by the faint glow of a streetlight coming through the window. Something was forming in his mind, not just analysis, but a plan. The world thought Marcus Sullivan was finished, a has-been, a cautionary tale of hubris and failure. But as he filled page after page with calculations and strategies, a flicker of his old confidence returned. He had built an empire once from nothing but an idea and determination, Perhaps he could do it again, not for the money or the status, but to prove to himself that his worth wasn't defined by his lowest moment. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin. Tomorrow, the beggar would act boldly. The Sullivan Technologies headquarters towered above the city skyline, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that Marcus had once commissioned at the height of his success. Now he stood across the street, clutching his notebook and fighting the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had spent hours in the public library, cleaning himself up as best he could in the bathroom, trimming his beard with borrowed scissors and washing his clothes in the sink. He looked marginally more presentable, but still a far cry from the commanding presence he once projected. Yet what he carried in his notebook might be worth more than any designer suit. A comprehensive analysis of the company's new strategy and a detailed breakdown of exactly where it would fail. Security would never let him through the front door. His face was too well known, and his fall from grace too notorious. Instead, he had timed his arrival to coincide with the lunch rush, when employees streamed out of the building in search of food or fresh air. Marcus positioned himself near a coffee cart that had always been popular with the staff, mustering what remained of his courage, when he spotted Diane Chen, the head of research and development and one of the few executives who had shown him kindness during his downfall. He made his move. "Diane!" he called, his voice cracking slightly from disuse. She turned, her expression morphing from confusion to shock to something like pity. "Marcus? Is that really you?" she asked, stepping away from her colleagues with a murmured excuse. "I heard rumors, but I never thought. Are you okay?" The question was loaded, impossible to answer honestly in a brief sidewalk encounter. Instead, Marcus held out his notebook, his hands trembling slightly with the importance of what it contained. "I need 5 minutes with Jennifer Reeves," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The company is headed for disaster. The new product line, the expansion into Asian markets, the restructuring of the R&D department, it's all built on fundamentally flawed assumptions. I've worked out the numbers, Diane. Sullivan Tech will be bankrupt within 18 months if she continues down this path." Diane took the notebook hesitantly, her professional curiosity clearly warring with her doubt. "Marcus, Jennifer has a whole team of analysts and consultants. What makes you think you've seen something they haven't?" she asked, but he could tell she was already flipping through his notes, her trained eye catching the significance of his calculations. The projections he had made, the market trends he had analyzed, the competitive threats he had identified, all pointing to the same inescapable conclusion. "Because they're trying to please her," Marcus replied simply. "No one wants to be the bearer of bad news to a new CEO trying to make her mark. And none of them built this company from scratch. They don't know its DNA like I do." She studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against his appearance, the brilliant CEO she had once respected against the desperate man who stood before her now. Finally, she closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I can't promise anything. Jennifer is protective of her vision, and your name isn't exactly spoken with reverence in the boardroom these days." Marcus nodded, understanding the risk she was taking even in talking to him. "That's all I ask. Just get those notes to her. What she does with them is up to her. I just couldn't stand by and watch the company implode without trying to help." As Diane walked back toward the building, Marcus felt a curious mixture of hope and resignation wash over him. He had done what he could, put his knowledge and insight out into the world without expectation of reward or recognition. If Jennifer was smart, she would recognize the value of what he had offered, regardless of its source. If not, at least he would know he had tried. He turned away from the gleaming tower that had once been the center of his universe and headed back toward the shelter. mentally preparing himself for the long wait ahead. He had planted a seed, now all he could do was hope it would take root. 3 days later, as Marcus was standing in line for a free meal at a downtown soup kitchen, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a face he recognized as part of the Sullivan Technologies security team. "Mr. Sullivan," the man called, drawing curious glances from others in the line. "Ms. Reeves would like to speak with you, if you'd be willing to come with me." Marcus felt every eye upon him as he stepped out of the line, a mixture of surprise and vindication flooding through him. The beggar had acted boldly, and someone had finally noticed. As he slid into the leather back seat, the contrast between his current state and his former life had never been more apparent or less important. What mattered now was the opportunity to be heard. The executive conference room on the 50th floor of Sullivan Technologies remained exactly as Marcus remembered it. The long mahogany table, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, the subtle scent of lemon polish and ambition. Yet everything felt different now that he sat on the visitor's side of the table, acutely aware of his worn clothes and the lingering smell of the shelter that no amount of public bathroom scrubbing could entirely eliminate. He waited alone, his notebook open before him, reviewing his findings one last time and trying to quell the trembling in his hands. This room had witnessed countless negotiations, brainstorming sessions, and strategic decisions under his leadership. Now it would witness his attempt at redemption, or his final humiliation. The door opened and Jennifer Reeves entered, followed by Diane Chen, and 2 other executives Marcus recognized as the Chief Financial Officer and the Head of Strategic Development. Jennifer was younger than Marcus by at least 15 years, sharp-featured and immaculately dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Marcus had to his name right now. She had been a rising star at a competing firm before being tapped to replace him, known for her aggressive growth strategies and her ability to charm investors. Now she regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed skepticism as she took her seat at the head of the table, his former seat. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice coolly professional, "I've reviewed the analysis you provided to Dr. Chen. I must admit, I was initially inclined to dismiss it out of hand. After all, our current strategy has been vetted by the top consulting firms in the industry and approved unanimously by the board." She paused, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against a printed copy of his notes. "However, certain aspects of your analysis were troubling enough to warrant this meeting, particularly your projections regarding the Asian market expansion and the vulnerability of our new product line to emerging competitors in the European sector." The admission seemed to cost her something, a slight tightening around her eyes, the only indication that this meeting was not entirely comfortable for her either. "Thank you for taking the time to see me," Marcus replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I understand your skepticism. In your position, I would feel the same way." He took a deep breath, reminding himself that he had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by speaking his mind. "The consultants you've hired are following standard industry practices and making reasonable assumptions based on available data. But they're missing critical factors about this company specifically, institutional knowledge that isn't captured in any report or spreadsheet." He turned to the first page of detailed notes and began to walk them through his analysis, pointing out the hidden connections between seemingly unrelated business decisions, the unique aspects of Sullivan Technologies' corporate culture that made certain strategies more viable than others, and the historical patterns that predicted how the market would respond to their initiatives. As he spoke, Marcus felt a familiar rhythm return, the confidence that came with absolute mastery of his subject matter, the passion that had driven him throughout his career. He forgot his shabby appearance, forgot the indignity of the past months, forgot everything except the problem before him and the solution he had crafted. The executives asked increasingly pointed questions, challenging his assumptions and testing his reasoning, but with each response, he could see the doubt in their eyes giving way to grudging respect. Diane was nodding thoughtfully, the CFO was frantically taking notes, and even Jennifer's professional mask had slipped enough to reveal genuine interest in what he was saying. "Your alternative strategy is certainly unorthodox," Jennifer said finally, after nearly 2 hours of intensive discussion. "Pulling back from the Asian expansion to focus on strengthening our core products, redirecting those resources to accelerate the development of the quantum encryption technology, partnering with European firms rather than competing directly." She tapped her fingers on the table, thinking, "It goes against everything the board is expecting, everything I've promised our investors." Marcus met her gaze steadily, recognizing the political challenge she faced. The board and investors want sustainable growth and long-term profitability. This path gets you there with significantly less risk and greater potential reward. It's just not as immediately flashy as a rapid global expansion. A heavy silence fell over the room as Jennifer studied him, clearly weighing more than just the business proposal before her. The symbolism of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. The fallen founder offering guidance to his replacement, the beggar presenting himself before the new queen of his former kingdom. Finally, she closed the folder containing his analysis and leaned forward. "I'm not prepared to completely abandon our current strategy based on a single meeting," she said, her tone measured. "But I am concerned enough by your projections to want a more detailed exploration of the alternatives you're suggesting." She glanced at Diane, then back at Marcus. "Would you be willing to work with our team as a consultant for the next few weeks, to fully develop this alternative approach and allow us to properly evaluate it?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. It wasn't the triumphant return Marcus might once have imagined, but it was an acknowledgement of his value, a chance to contribute, to be useful again. "I would," he replied simply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for his temporary consultant status, including a modest advance that would allow him to secure basic accommodations, Marcus realized that for the first time in months, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The beggar hadn't just acted boldly. He had begun to reclaim his identity as something more than a casualty of circumstance. The small corporate apartment provided by Sullivan Technologies was modest by the standards of Marcus's former life, but after months in shelters and on the streets, it felt like unimaginable luxury. A real bed with clean sheets, a private bathroom with hot water on demand, a small kitchen stocked with basic groceries, a closet containing 3 new button-down shirts, 2 pairs of slacks, and other essentials that had appeared without comment or fanfare. Diane's doing, he suspected. Marcus stood under the shower for nearly an hour that first night, letting the hot water wash away, not just the physical grime of homelessness, but something of the psychological weight as well. As steam filled the bathroom, he caught his reflection in the mirror and barely recognized himself, thinner, grayer, with new lines etched around his eyes, but with a spark that had been missing for too long. The following weeks developed a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Each morning, Marcus would arrive at Sullivan Technologies through a side entrance, avoiding the main lobby where he might be recognized by employees who remembered the scandal of his departure. He worked in a small conference room rather than an office, surrounded by spreadsheets, market analyses, and product specifications. The team assigned to work with him was small but strategically chosen. Diane from R&D, a brilliant young financial analyst named Raj, and a market specialist named Sophia, who had only joined the company after Marcus's departure. They approached him with initial wariness that gradually gave way to professional respect as they delved deeper into his alternative strategy. The problem with the current Asian expansion isn't the market itself, Marcus explained during one marathon session, circles under his eyes, testament to the late night he had spent refining his projections. It's the timing and the approach. Sullivan Tech is trying to compete head-on with entrenched local players who understand the cultural and regulatory landscape in ways we simply don't. We're burning through capital, trying to establish brand recognition, when we should be leveraging our technical superiority in very specific sectors. He pointed to a detailed map he had created, highlighting niche markets where the company's advanced encryption technology would have unique appeal. These financial and government sectors in Singapore, Japan, and South Korea, they're willing to pay premium prices for genuine security advantages. We don't need to capture the entire consumer market to make the Asian initiative profitable. Sophia, who had been the most skeptical of his approach, studied the map with growing interest. This is actually brilliant, she admitted, tracing the strategic entry points he had identified. Targeted penetration rather than broad market saturation. It reduces our marketing spend by nearly 60% while potentially increasing our profit margin on each sale. She looked up at him with newfound respect. Why isn't this standard practice in tech expansion strategies? Marcus smiled, feeling a teacher's satisfaction at a student's breakthrough. Because it's slower and less impressive in quarterly reports. CEOs want to announce that they've conquered a new market. Not that they've established a modest but highly profitable foothold. It's corporate ego over business sense. The week stretched into a month, and the scope of Marcus's consulting role gradually expanded. What had begun as a focused evaluation of the Asian strategy evolved into a comprehensive review of the entire corporate direction. Jennifer Reeves began to stop by their work sessions, initially for brief updates, but eventually staying for hours of detailed discussion. The dynamic between them shifted subtly, still formal, still marked by the vast chasm of their current circumstances, but increasingly collaborative. She was brilliant in her own right, Marcus had to admit, with a grasp of market psychology that sometimes exceeded his own. What she lacked was the hard-won wisdom of failure and recovery, the perspective that came from building something from nothing and then losing it all. The quantum encryption patent is the company's crown jewel, Marcus argued, during a particularly intense strategy session with Jennifer and the executive team. But you're treating it as just another product line rather than the foundation of the company's future. He pulled up technical specifications that highlighted the revolutionary nature of the technology. This isn't just an incremental improvement, it's a fundamental shift in data security. But the current development timeline has it buried under a dozen other priorities, and the marketing approach positions it as a premium add-on rather than a category-defining innovation. Jennifer frowned, studying the projections. Accelerating the development means pulling resources from other projects. The board is expecting results across all fronts. Marcus met her gaze steadily, recognizing the political pressure she faced. Leadership isn't about meeting every expectation, it's about setting the right expectations. The board wants sustainable growth and industry dominance. Show them how this technology achieves both, even if it means short-term adjustments elsewhere. There was a moment of tension as their wills clashed silently across the conference table. Then, surprisingly, Jennifer smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her usually guarded face. That sounds suspiciously like advice I gave my own mentor when I was coming up through the ranks, she admitted. Sometimes we forget our own wisdom when we reach the top. The admission seemed to cost her nothing, a sign of growing confidence rather than weakness. Draft a revised development schedule and budget reallocation. If you can make the numbers work, I'll take it to the board." As Marcus left the building that evening, he realized with a start that he had spent the entire day without once thinking about his fall from grace, without feeling the shame and resentment that had been his constant companions for so long. He had been completely absorbed in the work itself, in the pure satisfaction of applying his knowledge and experience to solve complex problems. The consulting fee he was earning was modest by industry standards, but sufficient to maintain his simple apartment and gradually rebuild some semblance of financial stability. Yet it wasn't the money that drove him now. It was the sense of purpose, of contributing value, of being seen not as a cautionary tale, but as a source of insight. The beggar who had acted boldly was becoming something else entirely. Not the titan of industry he had once been, perhaps, but something more balanced, more sustainable, and in some ways more satisfying. The quarterly board meeting loomed like a gathering storm on the corporate horizon, its approach filling the executive floor with a nervous energy that Marcus recognized all too well from his days as CEO. He had experienced dozens of such meetings from the hot seat, defending strategies, explaining setbacks, and selling visions of the future to people whose primary concern was the bottom line. Now, for the first time, he would experience one from the shadows, present but not central, influential but not ultimately responsible. Jennifer had asked him to prepare detailed supporting materials for her presentation of the revised corporate strategy, but had made it clear that he would not be addressing the board directly. His notorious status would be a distraction, she had explained with pragmatic honesty, and the focus needed to remain on the path forward rather than the complicated past. Marcus understood the political necessity, yet found himself pacing the small conference room that had become his workspace as the hour of the meeting approached. The strategy they were proposing represented a significant departure from the course Jennifer had initially charted. More measured in some ways, more boldly innovative in others, but fundamentally different in its underlying philosophy. It prioritized sustainable growth over rapid expansion, technical excellence over market saturation, and long-term industry leadership over short-term profit margins. It was, in many ways, a return to the core principles that had guided Sullivan Technologies during its most successful years under Marcus's leadership, though adapted to the current competitive landscape. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Diane entered, her expression unreadable. "Jennifer's asking for you," she said simply. "The board has questions about the quantum encryption development timeline that she thinks you're best equipped to answer." Marcus felt a complex surge of emotions, pride at the implicit acknowledgement of his expertise, anxiety at the prospect of facing the very people who had removed him from power, and a curious sense of completion, as if a circle was beginning to close. He straightened his tie, one of the new ones that had appeared in his corporate apartment wardrobe, and followed Diane toward the boardroom, steeling himself for whatever reception awaited him. The boardroom fell silent as Marcus entered, a dozen pairs of eyes turning to study him, with expressions ranging from open hostility to guarded curiosity. Several of the directors had been among those who had voted to remove him. Others were new faces, appointed after his departure. At the head of the table, Jennifer Reeves stood beside a projected display of technical specifications and market projections. She nodded to him, professional but not unkind. "Mr. Sullivan has been consulting on the revised strategy, particularly the accelerated development of our quantum encryption technology," she explained to the board. "I've asked him to address your questions about the technical feasibility and market positioning of this initiative." Marcus approached the display, feeling the weight of the moment, but finding an unexpected steadiness within himself. "The quantum encryption protocol represents a fundamental shift in data security architecture," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word. Current encryption systems will become vulnerable to quantum computing attacks within the next 3 to 5 years. Sullivan Technologies has a unique opportunity to establish itself as the definitive leader in post-quantum security solutions. D. He walked the board through the technical innovations, the development milestones, and the market strategy, with a clarity and confidence born of complete mastery of the subject. As he spoke, he could see the initial skepticism in many faces, giving way to grudging attention and eventually to genuine interest. The questioning that followed was rigorous but fair, probing the resource allocations, challenging the revenue projections, and testing the competitive analysis. Marcus answered each query directly, neither overselling the potential nor minimizing the risks, finding a balance between optimism and pragmatism that seemed to resonate with the directors. Jennifer added her own perspectives throughout, the two of them developing an unexpected rhythm of complementary expertise. His deep technical knowledge enhancing her market instincts, his experience tempering her ambition. By the time the technical portion of the presentation concluded, there was a palpable shift in the room's energy, a sense of emerging consensus around the revised strategy. As Marcus prepared to leave, allowing the board to deliberate in private, the chairman, a venture capitalist who had been an early investor in Sullivan Technologies, cleared his throat. "Before we move on, I'd like to acknowledge something," he said, his gaze fixed on Marcus. "The circumstances of your departure from this company were regrettable in many ways. Recent investigations have made it clear that while mistakes were made under your leadership, the fraudulent activities of your CFO were concealed from you through elaborate measures. You were not the architect of the company's problems, as many assumed at the time." The statement hung in the air, not quite an apology, but a public correction of the narrative that had destroyed Marcus's reputation. "Your willingness to contribute your expertise despite everything that transpired speaks to your character. The board appreciates your input today." Marcus nodded, accepting the acknowledgement without comment, understanding that it was as close to vindication as he was likely to receive in that setting. As he turned to leave, Jennifer caught his eye, a silent message passing between them that he couldn't quite interpret. He returned to his small conference room, emotionally drained but curiously at peace, regardless of what the board might decide. He had spoken his truth, offered his best insight, and done so without bitterness or recrimination. The rest was beyond his control, and for perhaps the first time in his driven, achievement-oriented life, he found that he was genuinely comfortable with that reality. Hours later, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the city skyline, Jennifer found him still at work, refining projections for the technical team. "The board approved the revised strategy," she announced without preamble, leaning against the doorframe with an air of exhaustion mingled with satisfaction. "Full funding for the accelerated quantum encryption development, targeted approach to Asian markets, partnership initiatives with the European firms, all of it." Marcus looked up, genuinely pleased, but not entirely surprised. The strategy was sound. The board, whatever their personal feelings about him, were ultimately pragmatic about the company's best interests. "Congratulations," he said sincerely. "It's a bold direction. The company will be stronger for it." Jennifer studied him for a long moment, then straightened and closed the door behind her. "I have a proposition for you," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Your consulting contract ends next week. I'd like to offer you a permanent position, Chief Innovation Officer, reporting directly to me, full benefits, equity options, and a salary commensurate with executive level." The offer was so unexpected that Marcus found himself speechless, searching her face for signs of hidden agenda or reluctance. He found none, only a clear-eyed assessment of value and opportunity. "Why?" he asked finally. "There must be 100 qualified candidates without my complicated history with the company." Jennifer's smile held a hint of irony. 100 candidates with your technical knowledge, perhaps, none with your unique perspective. You built this company from nothing, lost everything, and still cared enough about Sullivan Technologies to try to save it when you had nothing to gain. That kind of commitment and insight can't be hired at any price. She leaned forward, her expression intensifying. "I'm not offering charity or redemption, Marcus. I'm making a business decision. You see things others don't. You understand this company's DNA in ways I never will. Having come from outside, we make a good team, as the board meeting demonstrated. I need that perspective as we move forward." The simplicity and honesty of the assessment struck Marcus deeply. This wasn't about pity or second chances. It was about value and contribution, about what he could still offer despite or perhaps because of his journey through failure and survival. "I accept," he said quietly, extending his hand across the table. As they shook on the agreement, Marcus felt the final pieces of a new identity clicking into place. He would never again be the swaggering CEO whose self-worth was measured in stock prices and media mentions. That version of Marcus Sullivan had died in the scandal that stripped him of everything. But from those ashes had emerged something perhaps more valuable, a man who understood both success and failure, power and powerlessness, and had found a way to create value from the unique perspective that journey had given him. Later that evening, as Marcus stood at the window of his small apartment watching the city lights flicker to life, he reflected on the strange, humbling, and ultimately redemptive path that had brought him to this moment. From the heights of corporate power to the depths of homelessness, from the shame of public failure to the quiet satisfaction of earned respect, the journey had stripped away so many of his assumptions about worth and identity. The beggar had indeed acted boldly, reaching out from a place of complete vulnerability to offer value rather than ask for rescue. That simple act of courage and self-belief had set in motion a chain of events that led not to the restoration of what was lost, but to the creation of something new and perhaps more meaningful. As he prepared for his first official day in his new role, Marcus thought about the cardboard sign he had carried during his darkest days: "Former CEO will work for food." He had kept it folded and hidden away in his backpack, a tangible reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how little the external trappings of success really mattered. Perhaps one day he would frame it and hang it in whatever office eventually became his, not as a morbid souvenir, but as a testament to resilience, to the enduring value of knowledge and determination even when everything else is stripped away. The empire he had once built and lost would never be his again, but in its place, something more balanced and sustainable was taking root. Not an empire of ownership and control, but one of influence, insight, and authentic contribution. And in the end, perhaps that was redemption enough.